February 14, 1943. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, 14,000 feet. Lieutenant Saburo Kitamura rolled his Mitsubishi Is-6M0 fighter into a diving turn, chasing an American F4U Corsair that had just made a high-speed slashing attack on his formation. The Corsair pilot had fired a burst, destroyed Kitamura's wingman, and was now pulling away in a steep climb. Kitamura pushed his throttle to maximum, expecting to close the distance as he had done countless times against American Wildcats and P-40s. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But the Corsair continued accelerating away. Kitamura's airspeed indicator showed 310 knots, near his Zero's maximum speed, yet the American fighter was pulling away as if Kitamura were standing still. His engine screamed at maximum RPM, the Zero's lightweight airframe shuddering with the strain of full-throttle pursuit. Still the Corsair climbed away, its distinctive inverted gull wings growing smaller in the distance. What none of them realized was that this single impossible pursuit would expose the most devastating speed advantage in fighter combat history, a performance gap so vast that Japanese pilots would soon admit that intercepting Corsairs had become tactically futile regardless of pilot skill or numerical superiority. The Pacific Air War in early 1943 represented the twilight of Japanese fighter dominance that had been built on the Ace-6M0's legendary maneuverability and range. Zero pilots had achieved stunning success throughout 1941–42, destroying Allied aircraft at ratios exceeding 10-to-1 through superior turning ability that allowed them to dominate dogfights at any altitude. The Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outrange every Allied fighter it encountered during the opening phases of the Pacific War. Captain Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most experienced fighter tacticians and architect of the Pearl Harbor attack plan, had expressed absolute confidence in Zero capabilities during strategic assessments to combined fleet air staff. His evaluation reflected prevailing Japanese assumptions about fighter combat that would prove catastrophically outdated within months. The Zero's superior maneuverability provides decisive advantages in fighter combat that cannot be overcome through other performance parameters, Genda noted in his tactical assessment distributed throughout Japanese naval aviation. American fighters cannot match our turning radius or climb rate at combat altitudes. Victory in air combat is determined by ability to maneuver onto enemy's tail and maintain firing position, a capability where Japanese fighters maintain absolute superiority over all Allied aircraft currently deployed in the Pacific theater. Genda's confidence was supported by combat statistics from early Pacific operations where Zero pilots had achieved air superiority through tactics that exploited their fighters' tight turning radius and excellent low-speed handling characteristics. Japanese doctrine emphasized close-in maneuvering combat where Zero advantages were maximized and enemy numerical superiority could be negated through superior pilot skill and aircraft handling. The Zero's design philosophy represented Japanese naval aviation priorities that emphasized range and maneuverability over protection and firepower. Weighing just 5,313 pounds empty, the Zero achieved its remarkable performance through ruthless weight reduction that eliminated armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and heavy armament. This weight savings enabled the Zero to outmaneuver heavier Allied fighters, but created vulnerabilities that American designers would learn to exploit. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But 6,000 miles away in Stratford, Connecticut, American naval aviation engineers had been developing fighter aircraft that prioritized different performance parameters based on completely different combat philosophy. The WWII F4U Corsair represented American aviation design thinking focused on speed, firepower, and pilot protection rather than maneuverability, creating an aircraft that would revolutionize fighter tactics through pure performance advantages that made traditional dogfighting obsolete. The Corsair's development had been driven by U.S. Navy requirements for a carrier-based fighter that could achieve 400+ mph, a speed considered impossible for carrier aircraft by many naval aviation experts. WWII's solution was the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine producing 2,000 horsepower, driving the largest propeller ever fitted to a fighter aircraft. The resulting design featured distinctive inverted gull wings that provided ground clearance for the massive 13-foot propeller while maintaining structural efficiency. Commander James Flatley, one of the U.S. Navy's most innovative fighter tacticians, had been developing combat approaches that exploited American aircraft performance advantages rather than attempting to match Japanese maneuverability. His tactical concepts, developed through painful early war experience against Zero-equipped Japanese forces, would prove decisive in establishing American air superiority throughout the Pacific. American fighters possess fundamental advantages in speed, dive performance, and firepower over Japanese aircraft, Flatley noted in his tactical manual that would become doctrine for U.S. naval aviation. We should never attempt to match Japanese fighters in turning combat where their design advantages are decisive. Instead, employ high-speed slashing attacks that utilize our superior speed and structural strength to engage and disengage at will. Japanese fighters cannot catch aircraft traveling 70+ mph faster than their maximum speed, and their lightweight construction prevents them from following us through high-speed dives. Flatley's speed-focused tactics were being validated by F4U Corsair combat performance that was achieving results Japanese pilots found impossible to counter through any known tactical procedures. The Corsair's combination of speed, firepower, and structural strength was creating a fighter that could dominate combat through energy management rather than traditional maneuvering, a revolutionary concept that would define jet-age fighter combat decades later. The technical specifications revealed the magnitude of performance gap between aircraft representing fundamentally different design philosophies. The F4U Corsair could achieve 417 miles per hour at 19,900 feet altitude, exceeding the Zero's maximum speed of 330 miles per hour by 87 miles per hour. This 26% speed advantage meant that Corsairs could always dictate engagement terms, attacking when circumstances were favorable and withdrawing when threatened, while Zero pilots could never force unwilling Corsairs into combat. More significantly, the Corsair's superior speed was maintained across the entire flight envelope. While the Zero achieved its best performance at altitudes below 15,000 feet, the Corsair's supercharged R-2800 engine delivered maximum power at nearly 20,000 feet. This altitude advantage meant Corsair pilots could position above Zero formations, diving to attack with additional energy from altitude conversion, while Zero pilots struggled to climb to interception positions. The Corsair's structural advantages were equally decisive. The aircraft's maximum dive speed exceeded 550 miles per hour, far beyond the Zero's structural limits of approximately 410 miles per hour. This meant Corsair pilots could escape any combat situation by simply pushing into a steep dive that Zero pilots couldn't follow without risking structural failure. American pilots learned they possessed an absolute escape mechanism that made combat survival far more likely than Japanese pilots flying aircraft that couldn't match American dive performance. Lieutenant Commander Roger Hedrick, commanding VF-17 Jolly Roger's squadron flying Corsairs from land bases in the Solomon Islands, had been pioneering tactics that exploited these performance advantages with devastating effectiveness. His combat experience demonstrated how properly employed Corsairs could dominate Zero fighters despite their legendary maneuverability through systematic application of energy fighting principles. The fundamental principle is maintaining speed advantage at all times, Hedrick explained during tactical briefings with newly arrived squadron pilots. We position at altitude advantage above expected enemy formations. When targets are identified, we dive from altitude, accelerating to 400+ mph. We make high-speed firing passes through enemy formations, engaging targets with our 6.50 caliber machine guns, then zoom climb back to altitude before Japanese fighters can respond effectively. They can turn inside us in any maneuvering engagement, but they can never catch us when we maintain proper energy discipline. Hedrick's boom and zoom tactics were achieving kill ratios that reversed early war Japanese dominance and demonstrated the decisive nature of American performance advantages. VF-17 would complete its combat tour with 152 confirmed aerial victories against just 12 losses, a remarkable 12.7 to 1 kill ratio achieved against experienced Japanese pilots flying from well-established bases. This performance exceeded anything Zero pilots had accomplished against comparable opposition during their period of dominance. The engagement geometry that created Corsair tactical superiority was based on physics and mathematics that couldn't be overcome through pilot skill or tactical innovation. A Corsair diving from 20,000 feet could accelerate to 450 plus mph through combination of engine power and gravitational acceleration. After delivering a firing pass, the Corsair could convert its speed back into altitude through a zoom climb, returning to 18,000 plus feet while maintaining 380 plus mph throughout the maneuver. Zero pilots attempting to intercept these attacks faced impossible mathematical problems. Their aircraft's maximum level speed of 330 miles per hour meant they were always at least 50 miles per hour slower than attacking Corsairs, and often faced closure rate deficits exceeding 120 miles per hour when Corsairs dove from altitude. Even if Zero pilots achieved perfect tactical positioning, they lacked the speed to close firing range before Corsairs extended away and climbed back to altitude advantage. Ensign Ira Kepford, flying Corsairs with VF-17 and ultimately becoming the Navy's leading ace in the type with 16 confirmed victories, experienced the tactical revolution firsthand during engagements where Japanese fighters demonstrated complete inability to counter American energy fighting tactics. His combat reports, filed after each mission, documented Japanese tactical frustration with precision that revealed the psychological impact of facing opponents who couldn't be caught. Engaged formation of 6 Zeros at 15,000 feet during escort mission to Rabaul, Kepford reported after a mission in January 1944. Made diving attack from 18,000 feet, achieving approximately 420 miles per hour indicated airspeed. Destroyed 1 Zero with concentrated burst from all 6 guns at 400 yards range, then extended away at full throttle maintaining 400 plus mph. Remaining Zeros attempted pursuit but fell behind rapidly despite being in theoretically favorable position behind me. Climbed back to 20,000 feet, repeated identical attack. Japanese fighters again attempted interception but could not achieve firing position. Made 3 more attack runs using same tactics. Japanese fighters demonstrated complete inability to prevent repeated attacks despite maintaining formation integrity and attempting coordinated defensive maneuvers. Kepford's clinical description of engagement cycles that Japanese fighters could not prevent captured the fundamental transformation in air combat dynamics that Corsair performance was creating. Zero pilots who had dominated through superior maneuverability and aggressive tactics were facing opponents who could attack repeatedly at will while remaining beyond reach of defensive fire, creating psychological frustration that exceeded the tactical defeat. The Battle of Bougainville in November 1943 provided large-scale demonstration of Corsair speed dominance against numerically superior Japanese forces operating from established bases with experienced pilots. The engagement would become case study in how performance advantages could overcome numerical inferiority through systematic application of energy fighting principles. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading surviving ace with over 60 confirmed victories, led a formation of 16 Zeros against Marine Corsairs defending American positions on Bougainville. Sakai was one of Japan's most experienced and skilled fighter pilots, having survived continuous combat since the opening day of the Pacific War. His tactical skill and combat experience represented the best Japanese naval aviation could produce. His after-action report following the Bougainville engagement revealed how even Japan's elite pilots faced tactical helplessness when confronting American performance advantages. We encountered 12 American Corsair fighters at 12,000 feet altitude over Empress Augusta Bay, Sakai reported to his squadron commander with professional honesty that acknowledged tactical reality. American fighters were positioned at altitude advantage approximately 3,000 feet above our formation. Corsairs conducted repeated diving attacks from superior altitude, each attack destroying or damaging our aircraft. After initial attack destroyed 3 Zeros, surviving aircraft attempted to gain altitude to negate American advantage. Corsairs simply extended away at speeds we could not match, climbed to higher altitude, then repeated attacks. Sakai's report continued with increasing frustration. We attempted every known defensive maneuver. Tight defensive circle to provide mutual support. Corsairs simply attacked through our formation at speeds that prevented effective defensive fire. Split into elements to increase maneuverability. Corsairs engaged elements separately with overwhelming speed advantage. Attempted to force Corsairs into turning combat by positioning elements to trap attacking aircraft. Americans simply refused engagement when tactical position was disadvantageous, extending away before we could achieve firing positions. The report's conclusion was devastating. After 10 minutes of continuous engagement, Corsairs had destroyed 5 Zeros confirmed and damaged 3 more without suffering any losses themselves. American fighters remained beyond our ability to effectively engage throughout the combat. We could maneuver onto their tails during brief moments, but they simply accelerated away before we could achieve firing solution. Our ammunition expenditure was high but achieved no confirmed damage to American aircraft. This engagement demonstrated that American Corsair performance advantages negate our maneuverability superiority when they maintain proper energy discipline. Sakai's admission that Corsairs remained beyond our ability to effectively engage represented recognition by Japan's most experienced and successful fighter pilot that Zero tactics were obsolete against opponents with overwhelming performance advantages. The legendary ace who had survived hundreds of combats through superior skill and tactical innovation was acknowledging that skill provided no advantage against aircraft possessing such decisive speed superiority. The tactical helplessness that Sakai documented was being experienced by Japanese fighter pilots throughout the Solomon Islands campaign as Corsair deployments expanded and American pilots gained experience in exploiting their aircraft's advantages. Pilots who had achieved air superiority through aggressive maneuvering tactics were discovering that maneuverability became irrelevant when opponents could control engagement range through speed alone, creating combat conditions where Japanese advantages never came into play. Commander Tadashi Nakajima, serving as air operations analyst for the Combined Fleet Air Staff and responsible for evaluating fighter combat effectiveness across all Pacific theaters, had been compiling engagement reports for multiple combat zones. His statistical analysis documented patterns that were forcing Japanese naval aviation to acknowledge that fundamental assumptions about fighter combat were being invalidated by American technological and tactical evolution. American F4U Corsair fighters demonstrate speed advantages averaging 80 to 90 miles per hour over our Zero fighters at combat altitudes, Nakajima noted in his classified assessment circulated to senior Japanese aviation commanders. This performance differential enables American pilots to dictate all engagement parameters. They attack when circumstances favor them and withdraw when threatened. Our pilots cannot force unwilling Corsairs into combat regardless of tactical positioning or numerical superiority. Traditional fighter tactics based on maneuvering combat are proving ineffective against opponents who maintain energy discipline and refuse turning engagements. Nakajima's analysis continued with devastating statistical evidence. Kill ratios in Corsair versus Zero engagements are averaging 8-to-1 in favor of American aircraft. Our pilots report consistent inability to achieve firing positions against Corsairs employing proper energy fighting tactics. American losses occur primarily when individual pilots make tactical errors, bringing them into slow-speed maneuvering combat where our advantages can be exploited. Well-disciplined Corsair formations suffer minimal losses while inflicting unsustainable casualties on our fighter units. The assessment's conclusion was unambiguous. Current trends indicate our fighter forces cannot maintain air superiority against American Corsair-equipped units. Speed differential is too large to overcome through improved pilot training or tactical innovation. Zero fighters require replacement by aircraft matching American performance capabilities, or we must accept continued air superiority degradation in all theaters where Corsairs are deployed. Nakajima's official assessment represented the highest level acknowledgement that Zero fighters faced opponents they simply couldn't compete against through any available means. The performance gap was absolute and growing as American pilots gained experience while Japanese experienced pilot strength declined through attrition that couldn't be replaced due to inadequate training programs. The inadequate replacement training was creating cascading problems as experienced Japanese pilots who understood energy fighting concepts were being replaced by hastily trained pilots whose only experience was traditional maneuvering combat. These replacement pilots were being shot down at appalling rates by Corsair pilots who could engage them with impunity using tactics the Japanese pilots had never trained against. But perhaps most significantly, the Corsairs' performance advantages were forcing Japanese pilots to acknowledge that their aircraft's celebrated maneuverability provided no tactical benefit when opponents refused to engage in the maneuvering combat where zero advantages would be decisive. This psychological recognition that their fighters' primary strength was being rendered irrelevant was creating morale problems throughout Japanese aviation that exceeded what combat casualties alone could explain. Captain Minoru Genda, whose early confidence in zero superiority had shaped Japanese fighter doctrine, was now forced to confront combat reports that contradicted his fundamental assumptions about air combat. His revised tactical assessment, completed in late 1943, acknowledged the scope of American advantages with professional honesty that revealed complete recognition of how thoroughly Japanese fighter doctrine had been invalidated. March 20, 1944. Rabaul, New Britain. The tactical revolution was complete and irreversible. Japanese fighter pilots throughout the Pacific were operating under directives that explicitly acknowledged their inability to intercept Corsairs through conventional pursuit tactics. What had been unthinkable 18 months earlier, officially admitting that enemy fighters possessed uncatchable performance, had become accepted operational reality documented in tactical manuals distributed throughout Japanese naval aviation units. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Kiyomiya, serving as Tactical Operations Officer for the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service and responsible for developing fighter employment doctrine based on combat experience reports, had been forced to issue operational directives that represented complete abandonment of offensive fighter philosophy that had guided Japanese aviation since the 1930s. His tactical orders, distributed to all fighter units operating in the Central and Southwest Pacific, acknowledged defeat in ways that would have been professionally inconceivable during the early war period of Japanese air superiority. Fighter units will not initiate pursuit of F4U Corsair aircraft that disengage from combat through high-speed extension maneuvers, Kiyomiya's tactical directive stated in clinical language that barely concealed the revolutionary nature of the admission. The directive continued with specific guidance that revealed how thoroughly Japanese tactics had been transformed. Under no circumstances will our pilots follow Corsairs through high-speed dives exceeding 400 miles per hour indicated airspeed. Our aircraft's structural limitations prevent safe operation at these speeds, while American fighters are specifically designed for such maneuvers. Attempted pursuit under these conditions results in either structural failure or loss of aircraft control, with no possibility of achieving firing position against target aircraft. Kiyomiya's authorization to explicitly avoid engagement with specific enemy aircraft types represented revolutionary transformation in Japanese fighter philosophy that had traditionally emphasized aggressive attack regardless of tactical disadvantage. The Corsair had created conditions where Japanese fighters were forced into defensive operations, a psychological defeat that exceeded tactical implications and was eroding combat morale throughout Japanese aviation units. The defensive operations that Kiyomiya mandated were proving inadequate as Corsair squadrons expanded throughout the Pacific theater with operational sophistication that exploited every zero vulnerability. American pilots, gaining experience and confidence through successful engagements, were achieving kill ratios that exceeded 15-1 in some theaters through systematic application of energy fighting tactics that made Japanese defensive procedures meaningless. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, flying Corsairs with Marine Fighter Squadron VMF-124 operating from bases in the Russell Islands, achieved ace status through engagements that demonstrated complete Corsair tactical dominance over zero fighters attempting to employ Japanese defensive tactics. His combat record, which would eventually include 21 confirmed victories and a Medal of Honor, documented how American speed advantages negated all Japanese defensive innovations. Engaged formation of 80 fighters defending supply convoy to Rabaul at 18,000 feet altitude, Walsh reported after a mission in August 1943 that added 4 kills to his growing total. Japanese fighters maintained defensive circle formation when our division of 4 Corsairs approached standard tactic designed to provide mutual defensive support preventing single aircraft attack from achieving firing position. We simply ignored their defensive formation completely. Made high-speed diving passes through their circle from altitude advantage, destroyed 4 Zeros during 3 separate attack runs, then extended away at full throttle before survivors could respond with defensive fire. Repeated attack sequence twice more with identical tactical results. Walsh's report continued with observations that captured the futility of Japanese defensive tactics. Japanese pilots maintained excellent formation discipline and executed proper defensive maneuvers throughout engagement. However, their tactics are completely ineffective against aircraft possessing our speed advantage. We can attack through any defensive formation at speeds that prevent them from achieving firing solutions, then withdraw before they can coordinate defensive response. Their maneuverability advantage is negated when we maintain proper speed discipline and refuse turning engagements. The conclusion was devastating. Japanese defensive tactics developed against aircraft with comparable performance are obsolete against Corsairs employing energy fighting principles. We can engage at will, destroy multiple targets during single mission, and withdraw without suffering damage regardless of enemy numerical superiority or tactical positioning. American speed advantages have made air combat fundamentally one-sided when proper tactics are employed. Walsh's clinical description of Japanese tactics being completely ineffective and combat being fundamentally one-sided captured the tactical revolution that Corsair performance had created. Japanese formations designed to provide mutual defense worked effectively against aircraft with comparable performance but were useless against opponents who could attack through formations at closing rates exceeding 150 miles per hour and escape before defensive maneuvers could develop. The escape-before-response capability was creating psychological demoralization among Japanese fighter pilots that exceeded what combat casualties alone could explain. Pilots trained for aggressive offensive action were being forced into passive defensive roles where they watched helplessly as Corsairs attacked repeatedly at will while they proved unable to prevent attacks or achieve retaliatory strikes against opponents who controlled engagement geometry through overwhelming speed advantages. Warrant Officer Kinsuk Muto, flying Zeros in defensive Japanese positions in the Marshall Islands during late 1943, documented the psychological strain of facing Corsairs in his personal diary with emotional honesty that revealed morale degradation spreading throughout Japanese fighter units. His account, recovered after the war, captured the despair that speed disadvantage created among pilots who had once operated with confident aggression. Every day we see the Corsairs attacking our positions and supply ships, Muto wrote in December 1943. We scramble to intercept but they are always faster, always higher, always beyond our reach. When they dive on our formations, we attempt to turn into their attacks to force them into maneuvering combat where our agility provides advantage. But they simply extend away at speeds we cannot match before we can achieve firing positions. We fire at maximum range hoping for lucky hits but achieve nothing except wasting precious ammunition. The entry continued with increasing desperation. After each engagement we count our losses, always ours, never theirs. Today we lost 3 aircraft and 2 pilots. The Americans suffered no damage despite our best efforts. Our squadron commander says we must maintain fighting spirit. But what spirit can survive watching your comrades die while being unable to strike back? The Americans have created fighters we cannot defeat through any tactic we know. They attack when and where they choose, kill our pilots with apparent ease, then disappear before we can respond. We are not fighting an enemy, we are being hunted by predators we cannot catch or hide from. Muto's final entry before his death in January 1944 was haunting in its hopelessness. We received orders to escort bombers to American positions tomorrow. The Americans will send Corsairs. We know we cannot protect our bombers. We know some of us will die. We know we cannot prevent this. We go anyway because orders must be obeyed, but there is no hope of success. The war is lost in the air, even if our leaders refuse to admit this truth. Muto's admission that the war is lost in the air and his description of combat as being hunted by predators revealed the psychological transformation that Corsair speed advantages had created among Japanese fighter pilots. Men who had operated with supreme confidence during early war victories were now experiencing combat helplessness that destroyed morale more effectively than physical casualties. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated complete American fighter dominance over Japanese naval aviation and engagement that destroyed Japanese carrier aviation as effective fighting force. During what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American Corsairs and F-6F Hellcats, possessing similar performance characteristics and employing identical energy fighting tactics, massacred Japanese attack formations with kill ratios approaching 20-1 during sustained air battles that eliminated over 600 Japanese aircraft in 2 days. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrashu, flying F-6F Hellcat fighters from USS Lexington with performance and tactics matching Corsair operations, achieved 6 confirmed kills in 8 minutes during the battle through tactics that demonstrated how American speed advantages enabled systematic destruction of Japanese formations despite escort presence. His engagement report captured the one-sided nature of combat between aircraft with such disparate performance capabilities. Intercepted rate of approximately 50 Japanese aircraft approaching task force at 20,000 feet altitude, Vrashu reported after his remarkable engagement. Formation included Betty and Jill bombers with approximately 15 Zero escorts positioned above and alongside bomber stream. Dove through escort fighter screen at 450 plus mph indicated airspeed. Zero fighters attempted to intercept but could not achieve firing positions due to excessive closure rate. Destroyed 6 bombers with concentrated fire during single high-speed pass-through formation. Extended away at 410 miles per hour after attack pass. Japanese escorts were unable to prevent attack despite being properly positioned and making aggressive interception attempts. Vrashu's report continued, their escorts could do absolutely nothing to stop my attack. They were properly positioned, they attempted to maneuver into intercept positions, they maintained good formation discipline. None of it mattered. I was simply too fast for them to catch or cut off before I reached their bombers. I could attack their most valuable assets while their fighters watched helplessly. This is what American fighters do to Japanese formations every single day. We kill what we want, when we want, and they cannot prevent it. The phrase "could do absolutely nothing" captured complete tactical dominance that American speed advantages provided. Japanese escort pilots were executing proper procedures, maintaining correct positions, and flying with professional skill. None of it mattered when they were 120 miles per hour slower than attacking aircraft that could strike vital targets and escape before defensive response could develop. The inability to prevent attacks was creating strategic constraints that limited Japanese offensive aviation operations to suicide missions where aircraft survival was not expected. By late 1944, Japanese aviation was increasingly transitioning to kamikaze operations, partially because conventional attacks faced American fighter opposition that achieved near-total kill rates when using proper tactics. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, initiating organized kamikaze operations in October 1944, acknowledged in his private correspondence and staff discussions that American fighter performance had made conventional bomber attacks operationally unsustainable. His admission, documented by staff officers, revealed how completely American aviation dominance had destroyed Japanese offensive capabilities. Our fighter escorts cannot protect bomber formations against American interceptors possessing overwhelming speed advantages, Onishi wrote in classified communication to combined fleet staff. Conventional bombing attacks against defended American positions result in aircraft losses exceeding 80% without achieving mission objectives commensurate with these casualties. American Corsair and Hellcat fighters can intercept our formations, destroy our bombers, and withdraw before our escorts can prevent attacks or exact retaliatory casualties. Onishi's analysis continued with strategic conclusions. Mathematics of conventional attacks have become unsustainable. We expend 100 aircraft and 100 irreplaceable pilots to inflict damage that might disable 1 or 2 American ships. Americans replace losses through production capacity we cannot match, while our losses represent final consumption of limited resources. Special attack tactics using deliberate suicide strikes offer only operationally viable method for inflicting damage on American naval forces given our inability to survive American fighter opposition through conventional combat operations. Onishi's calculation that conventional attacks resulted in 80% losses without commensurate results represented mathematical demonstration that Japanese aviation faced American fighters it simply couldn't compete against using traditional combat methods. The transition to kamikaze suicide tactics was acknowledgement that survival against Corsairs and similar American fighters had become impossible. Better to guarantee hitting the target through deliberate crash than face almost certain death without achieving any mission effect. The impossibility of survival against proper Corsair tactics was being demonstrated daily throughout late-war Pacific operations as American fighter squadrons achieved aerial supremacy exceeding any previous air superiority in military history. Japanese fighters venturing into combat faced opponents who killed them systematically while suffering minimal losses through application of energy fighting principles that Japanese aircraft performance couldn't counter. Major Robert Hansen, flying Corsairs with Marine Fighter Squadron VMF-215 during late 1943, achieved 20 confirmed victories in just 17 days of combat operations through systematic application of Bougainville tactics that demonstrated complete American invulnerability to Japanese defensive measures when proper techniques were employed. His combat record, achieved before his death in a landing accident in February 1944, showed how effectively Corsairs could dominate numerically superior opposition. Engaged formation of 40-plus Japanese fighters during bomber escort mission over Rabaul, Hansen reported after a January 1944 mission that added 4 kills to his remarkable total. Made multiple high-speed passes through their formation over approximately 15-minute engagement period. Destroyed 4 confirmed, probably destroyed 3 additional aircraft. Japanese fighters attempted coordinated interception throughout engagement but could not prevent any of my 6 separate attack runs despite my repeatedly attacking the same formation. Hansen's report captured both tactical and psychological dominance. Their inability to prevent repeated attacks by single aircraft demonstrates complete tactical hopelessness they face against proper Corsair employment. I was attacking the same formation 6 times over 15 minutes. They knew I was there, they were attempting to intercept, yet they couldn't stop me from destroying their aircraft methodically. Speed advantage provides not just tactical superiority but creates psychological demoralization among enemy pilots who realize their efforts are futile. By war's end in August 1945, F4U Corsair squadrons had achieved overall kill ratios exceeding 11-to-1 across all Pacific operations, performance statistics that validated American aviation philosophy prioritizing speed, firepower, and pilot protection over the maneuverability emphasis that had guided Japanese fighter design. The Zero's legendary agility, which had dominated Allied aviation during 1941-42, had proven completely irrelevant against opponents who simply refused to engage in the turning combat where Japanese advantages could be exploited. The statistical dominance was reflected in individual squadron records that documented systematic American superiority. Marine Fighter Squadron VMF-214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron commanded by Major Gregory Boyington, achieved 197 confirmed aerial victories against 11 combat losses during 6 months of operations. Navy Fighter Squadron VF-17, the Jolly Rogers, recorded 154 kills against 12 losses. These weren't isolated exceptional performances, they represented typical results when Corsair units faced Japanese opposition. Saburo Sakai, having survived the war to become one of Japan's most respected aviation historians and living to document Pacific air combat from Japanese perspective, provided the ultimate professional assessment of Corsair superiority in his post-war memoir Samurai. His evaluation, written decades after combat's conclusion with perspective that came from survival and reflection, acknowledged American tactical and technological supremacy with professional honesty that revealed complete recognition of why Japan lost the air war. The Corsair represented everything we had come to fear in American fighters by 1943, Sakai wrote with the hindsight of someone who had faced every Allied fighter type deployed in the Pacific. Superior speed that we could never match regardless of tactical position. Superior firepower from 6 heavy machine guns that could destroy our lightly built aircraft with short bursts. Superior pilot protection that allowed American pilots to survive hits that would kill us. And most importantly, superior tactics that exploited their performance advantages while negating our maneuverability superiority. Sakai's assessment continued with tactical analysis that captured the revolution in fighter combat. We could outturn the Corsair in any maneuvering engagement. R0 could complete turns inside their radius, could maintain tighter circles, could theoretically achieve tail position in sustained turning combat. But these advantages were completely meaningless because American pilots who maintained proper energy discipline simply would not enter turning combat. They attacked from altitude advantage at speeds we couldn't match, destroyed our aircraft with accurate gunnery, then extended away before we could respond. We would maneuver into what appeared to be advantageous positions, only to watch Corsairs accelerate away before we could achieve firing solutions. The legendary Ace's conclusion was professionally devastating. The Corsair proved that speed trumps maneuverability in modern fighter combat when pilots employ proper energy fighting tactics. This was a lesson we learned too late and at terrible cost, measured in thousands of skilled pilots who died facing opponents they literally could not catch. American aviation philosophy, emphasizing performance over agility, firepower over lightness, pilot protection over weight savings, proved correct, while our design philosophy proved obsolete. The Zero was a magnificent aircraft for the combat conditions of 1941. By 1943, when facing Corsairs flown by well-trained pilots, it was a death trap that no amount of skill could compensate for. Sakai's admission that no amount of skill could compensate for performance disadvantages represented the ultimate vindication of American fighter development philosophy. Japanese pilots weren't being defeated through inferior training or inadequate tactics, they were facing aircraft performance advantages so overwhelming that skill became irrelevant. The most experienced and successful Japanese ace was acknowledging that American fighters had created conditions where Japanese pilot excellence provided no competitive advantage. The tactical revolution that the Corsair exemplified would define jet-age fighter combat for decades to come. Energy fighting principles developed against Zero opponents became doctrine for American fighter operations through the Korean War, Vietnam, and beyond. The fundamental concept that speed and energy management trumped maneuverability when performance gaps were sufficient proved applicable across multiple generations of fighter aircraft. In final analysis, Japanese pilots had been forced to admit what their pre-war doctrine had never anticipated and what their mid-war experience painfully demonstrated, that American fighters achieved such overwhelming speed advantages that interception became tactically futile regardless of pilot skill, numerical superiority, tactical positioning, or any other traditional advantage. The F4U Corsair had created combat conditions where Zero pilots operated with acknowledged helplessness, watching opponents attack systematically at will while being completely unable to prevent attacks, catch fleeing aircraft, or force unwilling opponents into combat. The psychological and tactical defeat was absolute and irreversible. Japanese fighter pilots, who had entered the war with supreme confidence in their aircraft and tactics, ended the war acknowledging that American fighters possessed performance advantages so decisive that combat survival became impossible when facing properly trained opponents. The Zero, which had terrorized Allied aviation throughout 1941–42 and remained in Japanese mythology as their greatest fighter, had been rendered obsolete by American fighters that simply couldn't be caught, creating the ultimate fighter-pilot nightmare of facing enemies who could kill at will while remaining forever beyond reach. The admission that Corsair's speed made Zero interception futile wasn't propaganda or excuse, it was mathematical and tactical reality that Japanese pilots experienced daily and that their most experienced survivors acknowledged honestly in post-war assessments. American fighter development had created weapons that didn't just defeat Japanese aircraft, they rendered Japanese fighter tactics completely obsolete through performance advantages that no amount of skill, courage, or tactical innovation could overcome.